number of, in fact, Jones and Smith were all over the map. They were in a half a dozen different religious groups during the course of their lifetime, but all of them with the focus on, let's get back to the Bible. Let's do what the Bible says. And so then I think maybe the third lesson I did was one that I had originally done while I was still teaching at the University of Kentucky. Methodist Church down there said, would you come and talk to us about churches of Christ? They were doing a series of, what does this church believe or that church something. So they knew that I taught this history of religion course at UK, so they said, would you come out and do this? So I told you what I told them, which is basically more about how John Wesley and O'Kelly and some of those in the Methodist background came out. And then I know I did a lesson on the new hymnal that would have been in 2012 because that's when it came out, and this was shortly after that. And I know I've done a lesson on instrumental music here. The ones that I've kept track of once we got sort of into this track, and by the way, Bill, this doesn't include the two that we did on archaeology and the Oriental Institute, and then we went one day, actually met at the OI and went through the museum there. But we continued this series in 2013, and I've got dates and so forth on most of these. And then in 14, I know we talked about some of the unity movements earlier this century. Daniel Sommer and Fred Kirshner down in Indianapolis. Kirshner was this prominent disciple minister involved with the Butler School of Religion. Daniel Sommer was a prominent preacher who had a kind of a following in the northern tier of states that was different from the David Lipscomb, Austin McGarry, what some people have called the Texas-Tennessee axis. We had a lot of southern churches, many of whom had been slaveholders or in the slave economy before the Civil War. Sommer was very much different from that. He was, his parents were German immigrants. He lived most of his life in either Ohio, most of it actually in Indiana, and preached for the old North Indianapolis Church, which became Emerson Avenue when I-65 construction took their old building back in the late 1950s. And that's the church that I grew up in, actually. I sat on a pew right near Bessie Sommer, who was Daniel's daughter, and edited the paper, did the office work on the American Christian Review. So we talked a little bit about those kinds of efforts to unify people who in the movement who had been differing over instrumental music and the Missionary Society and so forth. And Sommer finally became convinced that that wasn't going to work. And so he started to concentrate on what can we do together among those who, as he put it, have kept the worship pure. That is, didn't introduce instrumental music. And one of the big issues that we're going to talk a little bit more about this morning was what kind of institutions can, if any, can the church support? Sommer was widely known for being opposed to Bible colleges, certainly for them taking money from the treasury and being supported as an adjunct to the church, as a kind of a handmaiden to the church. A lot of people have the idea, without a Bible college, where would we get our preachers? We can't train preachers. We just got to have these Bible colleges. Well, Sommer was adamantly opposed to that. Late in life, when he made a tour of the southern states, a couple of them actually, and actually did what people who differ ought to do, which is what you tell me, what people, brethren, have differences with each other. What's one main thing they ought to do?
Civilized discussion.
I'm sorry?
Civilized discussion.
Absolutely. They ought to sit with each other face to face and talk about what are our differences and is there any way to resolve that. And what happens when you do that is there's less misrepresentation. I mean, a fundamental rule of settling controversy, whether it's confrontation in business or academia or whatever, is if you can't fairly state what the guy on the other side or the woman on the other side of the table believes so that they could at least recognize that as a first cousin to what they actually think, then you can't get anywhere. Because what often happens is we wind up intentionally or unintentionally misrepresenting what the other person believes, which says we don't really understand what they believe, or worst case scenario, we understand it, but we're going to deliberately make it look as bad as we can by misrepresenting. So anyway, that's what Sommer began to try to do. And then we talked last year about some of the developments that brought us up into the 20th century And you very graciously let me do my thing on changes in preaching, and even come back and repeat it because we didn't get it recorded. I think the first time was the deal. So that's kind of where we've been. Just to recap, what do we mean by a restoration movement? Well, what I mean by that is a movement to unite Christians. This was a unity movement, and sometimes that has a bad connotation. People talk about unity as though it's something that's not a good idea. I think because there have been people and movements in the past to try to unite on something that's not truly biblical. But how important is unity? What was on the Lord's mind and his lips in John 17, the last hours that he was on earth, that they may all be one, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. I mean, we compromise our approach to the world, our witness, if you will, our presentation to the world by being in a state of disharmony and disunion. And that's true generally, but I'll tell you, the number of small towns in the United States of America where the Church of Christ is known, not for preaching the truth, not for loving each other, they're known to just squabble and nitpick and fuss and fight. And that's just the reputation, to just be honest about it, deserved or not, and in a lot of cases it's deserved. So it was a movement to unite Christians by abandoning denominationalism, leaving creeds and doctrines of men and saying, why should we be divided over something the Bible does not say, rather than uniting on things the Bible clearly teaches? In other words, by restoring New Testament Christianity. So restoring New Testament Christianity was a goal, but in another sense, it was the means to an end. It was the means to get to unity. If we'll all just go by the Bible, the idea was and is, then we ought to be able to unite on that rather than being divided over all these creeds. Now, I've recommended a couple of things. I think last time I brought, it's that doorstop book that's down there under my iPad if you want to look at it, but it's this encyclopedia of the Stone Campbell movement, and it's got articles by people all over the place. I've got 6 or 8, I think, in there that deal with people like, I did the one on Daniel Summer, I think I did the one on Kirshner, did the one on Roy Cogdell, on Homer Haley, on a number of other people whose bios are there, did some of the institutional articles as well. But for the thing we're going to talk about today, I would recommend, if you're interested, a little book called The Simple Pattern, which actually incorporates a smaller pamphlet that I did years ago that's now out of print, The History and Background of the Institutional Controversy. I want to talk this morning about what's the nature of the church, and I'm already overheated, so I want to take my coat off and be a little bit more informal, if I can. And so what I did when this went out of print, this is the only copy I have left of this actually, is I rewrote it for something that Jim Deason does every year. He calls it Exploring Current Issues Conference, and he invites a number of younger preachers to come and listen to a number of us who are a little older talk about some things that we think are important. So in this particular year, which is 2011, I believe, or 2012 maybe, I think we did it in 11 and published this in 12, but I did the history chapter. So if you want to know what happened in the 20th century, there's 40 pages of that in here. And then some other people that spoke and contributed chapters, Paul Earnhardt, L.A. Stouffer, Bill Hall, Carol Sutton, and Dan King. So you got a pretty wide spectrum of different guys, some a little older than some of the rest of it, but I'll leave this up here if somebody wants to look at it. But that's a resource if you want more information about some of the things I'm going to talk about today. Now, if we look at biblical text on unity, I ask the question, how important is it? Well, the psalmist says it's good and pleasant, and uses all kinds of metaphors and analogies, like precious ointment. It's like the dew of Hermon ascending from the highest mountain north of Israel. For the Lord commanded the blessing, even life forevermore. And that's not just something from the Psalms. As I said earlier, Jesus' prayer in John 17 is that we might all be one, as thou, Father, art in me and I in thee, that they may be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. Now, with that as a baseline, the New Testament also recognizes the fact of division and the fact that it would occur, from our perspective, that it has occurred. I've tried to say to people who want to know why we should study church history is because it's a living laboratory of what the Bible said would happen, did happen. Scripture predicts this. It talks about the fact that people would fall away from the faith. And it tells us here that when you come together, I hear that there be divisions, that there are divisions among you. And Paul says, I partly believe it. I'll go Paul one better and say, I entirely believe it. I wholly believe it. For there must also be heresies, divisions among you, in order that there's a silver lining in this cloud. One of the things that does is that they which are approved may be made manifest. Those who are following the Lord. One thing division will do is it will make it crystal clear who is following the truth, who wants the truth, and who doesn't. And I've used the illustration before, but I'll say it again. I'm going to talk about this debate later. My dad, who passed away last year on March the 20th at age 93, took me to the Holt-Toddy debate in Indianapolis, 1954. I would have been 5 years old. And I insist that constitutes cruel and unusual punishment for a 5-year-old to take him to a religious debate, but evidently they couldn't get a babysitter and Mom was doing something. But anyway, but my dad said, he was a young man in his early 30s at the time, and he said, you know, you go to these debates and you'd hear one guy get up and you'd say, well, you know, that sounds reasonable. And then the next guy'd get up and you'd say, well, you know, that sounds pretty good to me. And he hadn't made up his mind about this. But he said after several nights, by the end of the debate, he said it became pretty clear who was really trying to search for what saith the Scripture and who was just trying to defend a position. I mean, he said it became pretty evident after a while. And I think that's what this text is saying, that those would be made manifest, would be made obvious, who are trying to serve the Lord. And we look at other texts like 1 John 2 and verse 19, where the apostle says, somebody went out from us. And if you look at the pronouns in 1 John, the us here are the apostles. What John says, what we saw, what our hands handled, what we observed, what we heard concerning the word of life, we proclaim to you back in the first chapter. And so in the second chapter, they went out from us. Well, who's the they? They were not of us. If they'd been of us, they would no doubt have continued with us, but they went out that they might be made manifest that they were not of us. They are not a part of the apostolic body. They are not listening to the apostolic preaching of the cross. They are not following the teaching of Jesus' apostles that he sent in his stead. And John says that is obvious when you have a division. Who is following what the Bible says? Who's following the apostolic message? And who's doing something else? And the division, as tragic as it is, will certainly do that. Well, all right, so here we are. You get into the 20th century, and you got this division that occurred actually in the late 19th century over the missionary society, over the instrument. The instrument's the most obvious thing because you can hear it. It became a kind of a focal point or oral point, I guess you'd say, of division. But in my mind, as I've said before, the missionary society, the perversion of the organization of the church, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to me, that's the thing that makes a lot of these divisions the same, going all the way back to the Roman Catholic Church, including the institutional controversy. Well, if we don't understand the nature of the church, the structure of the church, how it's organized, then we're going to continue to make the same mistake. But these folks in the Christian church actually also divided. They started the 20th century united around things like the missionary society and the instrument, and then they began to divide so that by 1926, by the first quarter of the 20th century, you had the development of the North American Christian Convention. A minority of these churches pulled off. They're more conservative. They objected to a lot of the liberalism that was being taught, for example, at the Disciples Divinity House over at the University of Chicago, or the Disciples Divinity House at Vanderbilt, or other places where some of their ministers were being trained in a very modernistic kind of way. And so these independent Christian churches, which didn't like what was being taught by the missionary society, pulled off and started their own conventions, started their own organizations, started their own colleges. They're actually technically and legally known as the Undenominational Fellowship of Christian Churches and Churches of Christ, which tells us a lot about it. They're saying, what would that title say to you? What are they at least saying they are? We're not a denomination. Whereas the disciples are proudly saying, we are a denomination. We've reorganized. We went through restructure in 1968. They completed it. They'd been at it for several decades, but they restructured and put their headquarters in Indianapolis, where a lot of their agencies and seminary and retirement pension fund and so forth already were. And they said, we are a denomination. We look like a denomination, we talk like a denomination, we think like a denomination. Let's quit this business of we're not a denomination and be honest about it and say we're a denomination. And that's exactly what they are. They wanted to get involved in the ecumenical movement, and they did and are involved insofar as those talks are still going on. But this undenominational fellowship is a way of saying we're not a denomination, but we are a religious group, we're a fellowship, and we call ourselves what? Yeah, Christian churches and churches of Christ. You ever travel, especially across the Midwest, and you're on vacation, you drive into a town in Illinois, Ohio, Missouri, Indiana, and there's a sign that says Church of Christ, and I've had this experience several times traveling when I was a kid. We'd go into a church, and my dad would spy a piano or an organ, or 180 right in the middle of the aisle, and out we'd go. It didn't matter who was looking at us or wondering, what are these heathen doing in here? My dad said, we're not worshiping there, because he grew up in the Christian church. And as he said to one fellow when we were in a religious discussion, the guy said, well, you don't really know what I believe. And my dad said, I grew up in that. I know what you believe. And so the idea is it's a kind of a halfway house. We accept the instrument. We think it's okay to have a missionary society. We just don't like the one these other guys have because it's too liberal, so we're going to create our own and create our own convention. And this organization is this loose fellowship. It's larger than a local church. People send donations to it. They pay membership fee. But nothing that's decided at the convention is binding on any of the churches. They don't have to do anything, just like the Southern Baptist Convention. I mean, I didn't know this until I took a course at Southern Baptist Seminary in church administration, which I had to finish in order to finish the program. Nothing the Southern Baptist Convention does is binding on any Southern Baptist church. And we talked before about the fact that the convention among the Baptists, Northern Baptist, Southern Baptist, Eastern Baptist, that's what the Campbells left when they started the Missionary Society. It was basically a convention by another name. Well, now, if a Southern Baptist church consistently flaunted whatever the convention decided, they'd probably be invited to leave the convention. But of course, if they're consistently flaunting and going against the convention, they probably want to leave the convention anyway, which is often what happens, is they get this kind of you can't fire me, I quit situation. But the point here is that among the Restoration churches, you get this three-way division, and among churches of Christ, which is actually, if we're going to extend this, it's hard to get all of this on one chart. If we're going to extend this, churches of Christ, what's on the next slide, would be to the right of this. So you have the most liberal part of it, the Christian church, the disciples. If you want to tell the difference just by driving down the street so you don't have to go and find out, the disciples is the group, their official symbol is the red chalice, the communion cup that has the cross on it. Usually it's red with a white cross. Sometimes they'll make the cross red against a white background, but that's their official denominational symbol. It's like, the Methodists have the flame going up the side of the cross. Well, the disciples' official symbol is this chalice with the cross kind of at a 45-degree angle. Then you get the kind of middle of the road people. And a lot of the folks, frankly, that are in the North American Christian Convention are still pretty conservative. When I lived in Danville, a town of 15,000 in central Kentucky, near Lexington, one of my best friends over the years was the guy that preached at the Independent Christian Church. We worked together on a lot of community projects. He was as opposed to alcohol as I was. We led an anti-alcohol referendum a couple of times. He believes in miracles. He believes in everything that the Bible says as far as the miraculous is concerned. He believes it's the Word of God. He still speaks the language of restoring New Testament Christianity. We have a lot in common. Now, they use the instrument, and they have puppet shows, and they do a lot of things that some of our liberal brethren do. But I once made the observation that I had more in common with him in the Christian church than I did with the guy at the liberal institutional Church of Christ on the other side of town, which is so far out in left field, I can't even describe it. I mean, the guy that's in this group is more conservative, if you will, than the guy that's in the institutional liberal wing of Churches of Christ. And so if you looked at Churches of Christ, which would be again over here on the right if we were putting all of this together, what's happened in Churches of Christ in the late 20th century, 21st century is almost identical to that three-way split that I just described. You have people on the far left, and just to be candidly, to name churches that would be associated with or in the orbit of Pepperdine University, Abilene Christian, David Lipscomb University, probably the more conservative colleges sort of in the middle here, the moderate group that doesn't go along with all of that would be probably Harding and so forth. But did I put my picture of the tattooed lady up last time, Bill? I thought I did. A couple of years ago, and when they did this, I said, I'm never going back to Pepperdine. I've tried to speak there a couple of times, but they had as an invited speaker at their lectureship, a woman Lutheran pastor, Nadia Bowles-Weber is her name, in Denver. And she's got tattoos everywhere. She hosts drinking parties, though on a Sunday night at her Lutheran church, they have beer and hymns. And her rationale for it is, well, Luther did it, so it must be okay, right? If Martin Luther did it, why, we're Lutheran, we'll do it too. And the Washington Post description of her is the most foul-mouthed preacher you'll ever hear. So this Christian college asked her to come and be a keynote speaker on their lectureship. And as the dean of another Christian college said to me, we were eating dinner one day, and he said, what? And it's not Florida College, but he said, what were those boys smoking when they asked this woman to come? I mean, it's a wonder. So there are the people in institutions. Now, I personally, my theory is they had just invited a woman to come and be the chaplain at Pepperdine. And so if you're going to give cover for that, then you have somebody even more outlandish to come. And I ought to put that picture up, Bill. I may have it on here at some point. But anyway, this gives you an idea of where we're going. So looking at Churches of Christ in the 20th century, what you have particularly after World War II is you get a kind of a new generation of leadership. Daniel Summer died in 1940, F.D. Shrigley died in 1940, J.D. Tant died in 1940, 3 or 4 well-known preachers who'd been preaching for 50, 60, 70 years, all of them died within about a 12 or 15-month period. And you get this new generation of leadership. You also get a kind of an upward social mobility spiral after World War II, building a lot of buildings. The church moved out beyond the tracks, often met in a little frame building. We talked about this, I think, last time. And you get the expansion of colleges that had to do with the GI Bill. Before World War II, maybe 10 or 12% of Americans went to college. College education was largely for the upper or upper middle classes, with one exception. There were a lot of normal schools, teacher colleges, so there were a lot of people that were educated on scholarship at teacher colleges. After World War II, way upwards of 50% of people, and probably today approaches 75 or 80%, maybe more people who go to college of some kind or another. So you get all these colleges being built or being expanded, and in addition to the GI Bill, which paid for a lot of this, and also gave the colleges a lot of equipment. I mean, most of the colleges, to house this increase in their membership and their students, they would take GI Quonset huts that were now surplus and set them up on a part of campus, and that's where you lived if you were a GI. Orphanages grew by leaps and bounds. Before 1940, or in 1940, there were 5 orphanages in Churches of Christ. I think I can name them: Potter, Child Haven down in Coleman, Bowles Home in Quinlan, Tipton in Oklahoma, and what am I leaving out? Tennessee Orphan Home, those 5. By the end of the 1960s, there were at least 40, maybe as many as 50 orphanages that had been started, and all of them had their hand out begging for money. all of them wanting the churches to support them, as the colleges did. The colleges also made an argument, you need to support our Bible department especially, because where else are you going to get preachers if we don't train your preachers for you? Now, which one of those would have more appeal, you think? A college or an orphanage? Well, all right, maybe.
Because of who you are.
Yeah, it depends on who you are, but if you're trying to sell your organization and you're in a place where colleges are kind of viewed as intellectual and elite, and a lot of people still are not able to go there, and somebody goes off to college and they come out with a big head and they think they know more than you do, but your sales pitch for the orphanage is, here's this poor little orphan kid in a tattered dress or a tattered shirt, and they've got a tear running down their face. Which one of those you want to try to sell to the brethren? Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yeah. Being pushed everywhere. I can remember as a kid, before we moved to Emerson Avenue, we were at Irvington, which is probably at that time the largest church north of the Ohio River, possible exception to Thayer Street in Akron. I mean, it was a large church. Earl West, that wrote The Search for the Ancient Order, was the preacher there, performed the marriage ceremony for my mom and dad. And when he left to go teach at Freed Hardeman, they got another guy in there who was very much pro-orphanage. And I can remember guys coming and on a Sunday night and preaching a short 10, 15-minute sermon, and then they would get their charts out and do their picture show about, here's why you need to support our orphanage. And that's a pretty easy sell. And in fact, the guys who were promoting the college kind of felt the sting of that you could get support for an orphanage, but churches were by and large not willing to support a college. So you had a couple of fellas, N.B. Hardeman, who was the president of Freed Hardeman, and Batzel Barrett Baxter, who was at David Lipscomb and was the chief speaker on the Herald of Truth. You could hear him all over the United States. Anybody ever hear Batzel Barrett Baxter on the Herald of Truth radio TV program? I did. Grew up listening to him. When I preached in Florida, a bunch of us would carpool back from North Florida every Sunday, and at 8 o'clock we tuned in WLAC in Nashville, which had a southern, we pick it up in Florida, and we listened to Batzel Barrett Baxter on the Herald of Truth radio program. And the argument these guys made is that the college and the orphanage do what? Can anybody finish the sentence? They stand or fall together. The same principle that would justify a church giving money to an orphanage is the same principle that would justify a church giving money to a college, because they're both doing the work of the church. I mean, they were very blatant about it. The church cannot function in orphan care unless you give to these orphanages. The church cannot do the work of this institution. Well, there's a sense in which that's true. The church is not in the orphanage business. So if it's going to do institutional orphan care, it's going to have to use somebody's orphanage. Well, we'll talk more about that later. The question is, did God really intend for the church to get into the institutional orphanage business? Did God intend for the church to get into the college business? No. So if you're going to send your kids or your preacher to college, then you're going to have to pay the college, and that was the argument that the church ought to do this because we're training preachers for the church. So there was that issue. Sponsoring churches, which were relatively rare in the early 20th century, now become all the vogue. This is where a large church like Highland and Abilene would take in money from 3,000 smaller churches in order to put on the Herald of Truth program, which cost buckets of money, even when it was just radio. And then if you go to TV like they did in 1952, now you're 10, 15, 20 times more expensive than radio. And after all, if we're churches of Christ and we're building all these new buildings and we want to show that we're as good as the Christian church, we can build a building just as good as the Baptist, and that was the pitch that was being made, then we need to have the Baptists have the Baptist hour, the Catholics got Fulton Sheen, the Lutherans have the Lutheran hour, we need to have the Church of Christ hour. And we need to put somebody like Batzel Barrett Baxter, PhD, on the air and let people see this is what churches of Christ are like. It was a PR sort of thing, and these sponsoring churches grew up in case of Highland and Abilene, to do the TV program. Other churches in Texas usually, but Union Avenue in Memphis, said we will take the oversight of the work in Japan, or we will take the oversight of the work in Germany. All these GIs who came back from the war and had seen the devastation in Japan and Germany and Italy and other places They were interested in sending funds back over there to help spread the gospel. Well, how do you do that? Well, these people organized these sponsoring churches that said, we will take the oversight of the work in Italy, the work in Germany, the work in Japan, and if you want to work there, then you have to work through us. And in some cases, they made agreements with the governments of these countries that they would be the sole representative of churches of Christ. If you wanted to go there and preach, you couldn't go just as somebody being sent by a local church. You had to get the recognition of the government authority. So you get these television ministries sponsoring churches and so forth. The orphanages, I mentioned a few of them. You get this growth of colleges, and you get this orphanage college linking. The church stands or falls together. When Hardeman said that in 1947, that was a little bit too early. Churches weren't buying it. A lot of churches were still in a growth process. By 1962, 15 years later, when Baxter gets up this big church in Nashville and preaches this sermon that then gets printed in a pamphlet and mailed out, 100,000 copies mailed out all over the country, and he says the orphanage stands or falls together, here's the representative of Churches of Christ on the Herald of Truth saying it's okay for a church to send to a college. And in some ways that carried the day, but those are the kinds of, when we talk about institutionalism, that's what we're talking about. All of these colleges, orphanages, homes for unwed mothers, homes for the aged, many of which, by the way, have gone out of business. A lot of these orphanages have gone bankrupt and sometimes taken down their sponsoring churches with them. I think the Central Church in Houston, within the last decade or so, I think, if I'm reliably informed, had to sell their property in order to pay off the closure of an orphanage that they were responsible for. And it also lays bare a distinction between some of the people who argued for orphanages. Most of the orphanages east of the Mississippi River, Coleman in Alabama, Potter in Kentucky, Tennessee Orphan Home, Schultz Lewis, which over here in Valparaiso, which when Earl West left Indianapolis and went to teach at Freed-Hardeman, another guy came in. My grandfather resigned as an elder in conjunction with the more liberal. There were 5 elders. They disagreed pretty vehemently over this issue. They said, let's resign to keep the peace, let the other 3 guys run it. That didn't work too well. My dad was a deacon and the treasurer there, and ultimately he was told, you either write a check to Schultz Lewis Orphanage or you can turn in the checkbook and go somewhere else if you can't get with the program. Now, that doesn't leave a young man in his 30s much room to maneuver, and so that's when we wound up going to this other church where the Sommer family had been for 50 years. But I forgot where I was going with that before I started. Oh, these orphanages that were east of the Mississippi were largely run by boards. That is, they were not a part of the church. They were not overseen by churches. They were independent agencies that were legally owned and operated by a board of directors. Usually members of the church, whereas most of the orphanages west of the Mississippi, which would be the Texas and Oklahoma orphanages, were actually overseen by churches. Gene?
How did they determine what orphans went to these orphan homes? Was it something that had to be related somehow to church or to just anybody?
I think it varied from orphanage to orphanage, and I'm not an expert in that. You'd have to do some research to really answer that, but it's one interesting point of that is I think generally speaking they took children that came largely out of Churches of Christ. But because the Baptists had their own orphanages and the Lutherans had theirs and so forth, but I think many of them would take orphans if they could find financial backing for them. Usually what happened was, if a church, I know of a case in Indianapolis where there was an orphan, not a true orphan, but a mother who couldn't care for her children. And so they took the children out of the home and they sent them down to Potter on the premise that the church would take from its treasury and send money to Potter Orphanage in order to foot the bill for this, rather than caring for the child by putting the child in a foster home. Now, which was the model nationwide that nearly everybody else was using, was to get out of the orphanage business. State orphanages, denominational orphanages were largely closing their doors or scaling back because they recognized That's not a very good way to raise young children. Just put them in a warehouse, put them in a dormitory, have a dorm parent for 30 kids. That's not very good. And so they began to move to a foster home model where you actually put the child in a natural home, and the parents in that home became in loco parentis, in the place of the natural parents, if you will. Now, a foster care model, as we all know, has its own boatload of problems. That's not a perfect solution either, because sometimes the parents are not screened, sometimes they're doing it just to get money from the state or from some other agency, but it sure is a much more natural or biblical model than putting the kids in a warehouse somewhere. So Churches of Christ were just getting into the orphanage business, the warehouse business, if you will, as everybody else was getting out of it. So it's like a lot of other things. We tend to be kind of 50 years behind what everybody else is doing. We're just getting into it. Churches of Christ largely got into bus ministries in the 1970s when a lot of the Baptist churches were getting out of the bus ministry. And so that's a kind of a pattern. One other interesting thing, particularly in places, I don't know about Schultz Lewis, but at Potter, at Coleman, at Child Haven, they actually had written into their charters that they would not take what were then called Negro children, African American children. So it didn't matter from where or by who or what the circumstance was. If you were African American, sorry, doors closed. And in fact, I have a friend who preached in Minneapolis for years and actually was able to persuade a number of people to leave some of the African American churches up there and come to worship by it. He'd just take a copy of some of the orphanage newsletters that he got, and he'd just say, "You see any black kids here? You know, these are white segregationist institutions." And so in a sense, it just makes the point they're kind of culture bound. They're a part of their own society, if you will. So other than that, I don't know how to answer your question, but I think largely these were, for the most part, children that came from some source in Churches of Christ. But I'm pretty sure that if somebody else offered to send a child and send them money to cover that they would take it. Because, I mean, it costs money to run this, whether you think it's right for churches to do it or not. Every institution requires funds to run the place. So my guess is that if there was enough money involved in it, that they would happily take a child from some other source. But the idea originally was they would come from Churches of Christ. So my point is, you get all of these institutions of a wide variety, including a lot that are not on here, and it was almost like the Churches of Christ got into an institutional mania, that if you're not supporting an orphanage, then you're anti-orphan. If you're not supporting a college, you're anti-education. If you're not supporting Union Avenue in Memphis to help these guys go preach in Japan, or you're not supporting Brownwood, Texas to go help somebody preach in Germany or Italy, you're not supporting the Herald of Truth, and you don't believe in evangelism. You don't believe in sharing the gospel. You've got to participate in our program, or you've got to, you need to give it up and go somewhere else. And so there was a lot of rhetoric, there was a lot of labeling, a lot of name calling, and a lot of institutional begging and pushing, if you will. And I am still of an age that I can remember as a small kid some of this back and forth. I don't remember anything from the Holt-Toddy debate when I was 5, but I can remember things from when I was 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, as my parents were having to leave one congregation, and I had to leave all my Sunday school buds and guys that I'd known for several years and, ran around in the parking lot with and crawled around under the pews during the service from time to time. I'd leave all my buddies and drive halfway across Indianapolis to go to another church, and I'm like, why are we doing this? What's the deal? And but I understood some of it. So that's some of the developments here. These institutional issues hardened through some of the writing in the papers, some of which on the left side were largely older papers that were pro-orphanage, pro-college for the most part. And there were others then on the right side that were begun specifically to counter some of these things. The Gospel Guardian in 1948, Truth Magazine actually was a Chicagoland publication started by Leslie Dieselkamp and others who were preaching in the Chicago area in 1956. Although their focus at that time was largely a lot of guys in Churches of Christ were leaving the church and going to the disciples because they had been educated in the University of Chicago or other places and were leaving. When Leslie then founded the paper, went to Nigeria for a year or two and came back, he said the focus had changed, and now the churches were more concerned about supporting orphanages and colleges. Searching the Scriptures was started in 1960, largely by the faculty at Florida College, although it was soon sold to a private owner and run after that. There were a lot of these debates. The first one was that debate I referenced in Indianapolis, but then there were a number of them. But over that 5 or 6 year period, by 1960, the lines had been pretty firmly drawn in most places. And you were either in an anti-church or you were in a, quote, mainstream church, as they sometimes like to call themselves. And there's all kinds of pressure to line up during this time. Florida College was threatened, and in fact its main donor pulled out and pulled his money out of the college in the mid-1950s, nearly sent them into bankruptcy and actually threatened their accreditation in the mid-1950s. The CEI bookstore, started by Benny Lee Fudge in Athens, Alabama, opened a store in Abilene. They were put out of business there because of a boycott by churches that said, if you won't line up with us, then we're not going to patronize your business. People were said to be anti-foreign evangelism. Yes, that has too many N's in it there. You won't help a starving orphan. Fertilizer bags waved from the pulpit in some of these debates. You aunties would pay to put fertilizer on the church lawn or the preacher's house, and you won't send a dime to help a starving orphan. And a dime, by the way, was about the average contribution. Somebody did a calculation when all this stuff was going on and calculated that the average support per member per week of churches that sent to an orphanage. Anybody want to guess how much they were sending per member per week, dividing the church over this stupendous sum? Anybody want to take a guess? 7 cents. 7 cents per member per week was what they were getting being sent from church treasuries to that. Either write a check or resign. My dad was not the only one to go through that kind of an experience. If you look at the ads in the Gospel Advocate, no ante need apply. If you're an ante, you don't even need this. If you want to preach here, you know, if your preachers were told, if you don't quit preaching this anti-doctrine, you won't have any place to preach. A lot of preachers were fired because they dared to teach the truth on these issues and were let go. Meetings were canceled. The Gospel Advocate for several years printed confessions of preachers who recanted. Earl West was one of them. Said, I used to be an anti, but now I confess that that was a sin and I don't teach that doctrine anymore, and I'm available for meetings, because there was a lot of pressure put on people to line up with that. I had one brother who told me that church where he was, and he said, I'm not the only one, we send $10 a month to an orphanage just so we won't get labeled anti. We're not really sold on that's the best thing to do, but just there's too much pressure, so it's just easier to write a $10 check and send it to the orphanage, this is in the late 1960s, than to get plastered with the label anti. And so, I mean, you get all kinds of stuff like this. The only anti-church in the Bible is Antioch. And that's about the level of biblical argument that a lot of these people could make about that. There were lawsuits. The church at Expressway, where I preached in Louisville, started as a result of a lawsuit at Taylor Boulevard that was splashed across the pages of both daily newspapers. Brethren were locked out of the building. One of the elders at Expressway told me that one day out in the lobby, 4 big brothers who were opposed to him got to just pushing him around. He said, I felt like a football. They just pushed me physically from one guy to the other, and he'd push me on to the next guy. My wife's dad was actually struck with a fist, a closed fist, by an elder in a church in Middle Tennessee because he dared to preach against what the churches should not be engaged in this kind of institutional orphanage business or other things. And in fact, at another place where he then went to preach, one night 6 or 8 of the other brothers had to form a sort of cordon around him to get into his car, because there were other brothers who were just so incensed at this that, I mean, it was just an ugly time, not everywhere maybe, but in a lot of places. I mean, I sometimes say, well, people will say that this just happened in a few places. Well, there's a whole list of stuff that could be duplicated 100 times over. So it's not like it happened everywhere, but it happened enough that. Now, time passes. If we go back to this chart here, things don't stay the same over a period of a generation or two. So what starts out where in the 1950s, the institutional moderates, what came to be called the liberals, they'd kind of be all together. For one thing, they're concentrated on their anti-anti. They're against the antis. But over time, those groups begin to separate. And so from 1950, or from the 1950s to 1985, when several hundred of these institutional preachers became so concerned with the direction of things that were going among institutional churches, and the guys that signed this expression of concern read like a who's who of the people who argued for the orphanages and TV programs in the 1950s, but a lot of the younger preachers a generation later now, 30, 35 years later, are now taking things way beyond anywhere that they thought they ought to go. So they said, we are deeply disturbed over the liberalism that's so evident in the brotherhood today. By liberalism, we mean the following 5 items. They specify 5 things. Number 1, or A, there's a drifting from the Bible-centered, definitive, distinctive doctrine that once characterized our preaching. Many of our people, including preachers and elders, no longer know the difference between true Christianity and the corrupted forms of it so prevalent today. So our preaching has changed, they're saying. There is a concerted effort, secondly, on the part of some brethren to restructure the organization, the worship, and the work of the church along sectarian lines. If the Baptists do it, we want to do it. If the Lutherans are doing it, we want it. And if it means we have to restructure the worship, it means we don't want to go as far as instrumental music, but if we can bring in a praise team and have somebody spit in the mic and sound like a bass drum, or somebody else sound like a violin or a clarinet, why, we'll do that. They just stand behind the singers so nobody really sees what they're doing. And so they're concerned about that sort of thing. A spirit of doctrinal compromise and fellowshipping of those in blatant religious error has permeated our ranks. Now, these are not antis that are saying this. These are guys that are in the institutional camp with both feet up to their neck in these institutions, but they are scared about the direction that a lot of people are going. Fourth, the world has made alarming inroads into the church. Instead of the church influencing the world for righteousness, the world has adversely affected many brethren in matters of morality and conduct of life. And I'll pause here to say, this is 1986, 85 maybe. It's now 2016. We're 30 years out from that. Does anybody see anything among conservative churches of Christ that might be a little bit like this? Has the preaching changed? Has the world influenced the church rather than the church influencing the world? You can say the same thing, so it's not like our skirts are clean, so to speak, or we got to clean. I'm sorry? I'm sorry? Yeah, all of them. All of them are. And then finally, they said the typical emphasis of the denominational world on recreation, entertainment, and solving the social ills of society has been incorporated into the programs of many congregations, supplanting the God-given work of meeting the spiritual needs of those both within and without the body of Christ. I have to tell you, I first read this, I almost had to refrain from laughing out loud at this. I mean, these are the guys who started this. They're the ones who put the emphasis on the recreation, on the hot dog for vacation Bible school, on the bus with the lucky seat, on the, bringing in kids with some kind of recreational program, building a family life center, putting Pac-Man games in the basement so that the kids would have something to do afterwards. And now they're wringing their hands and crying about recreation and about all of this stuff. I mean, it just makes you want to scratch your head. But the point is, this was 30 years, a generation later from when these folks started doing that, and now they're wringing their hand at doing that. Willard Collins, who was either president or vice president, I forget which, at David Lipscomb, wrote a memoir late in his life. This is 1986, and he was asked to compare church members in the 1980s, when he was in his last decade, with those 50 years earlier when he started preaching in the 1930s. Here's what he said. I don't think they see the glory of the church unencumbered with denominationalism as I did when I was growing up. I don't think members of the church see it as different from Protestantism. We're just as good as, or just like the evangelicals. He says, whoop, I'll get back to the previous one. He said, when I started preaching, a lot of members of the church believed Protestants needed to be saved. You couldn't be in a Baptist church and be saved, and now we've got people, he's saying, that kind of believe the Baptists are okay, or the Presbyterians or whatever. At an earlier time, they felt the church was a lot better than Protestantism. And he says, we have lost a lot of that. So I want to move now to ask more doctrinal kinds of questions. Maybe I should stop before we do that. It's 11, so we've been at this an hour. Anybody have questions? You can wind me up and I'll go as long as I want. Usually we've gone for another half an hour or so with questions, and I can do that. Yes, ma'am.
I don't have a question, but when I first became a member of this church back in the late 50s, they leaned for a member of it until we got elders, and they went down and checked that all orphanage out.
Yep.
When they came back, they saw that that wasn't the thing to do, and so everything started changing. But in 1962, part of the people that was in a congregation still believed in the liberal side of it, so they left and went to Lansing.
Yeah.
And then things got better, so from then on, the church was more conservative. But I grew up in really hard in Tennessee, so I know all about it.
Yeah.
And I had a scholarship to go there. Thankfully, I got sick and didn't go, otherwise I'd probably been very good liberal preacher.
Yeah. I had a conversation, you could say this, the same thing happened at Downers Grove, the people that were there. Gene, you probably could tell tales about Joliet or Elgin or some of these different places, and Bill and Ray and the rest of you too, I'm sure could do that. I had a conversation with a family that I stayed with in Tampa when we were doing the last recording that we did for the Symphonia, for the hymnal. And turns out, I had known her when she was smaller. She grew up in a church in North Dakota, and I used to go up there and do meetings every summer. But she said, I went to Harding College because the church that I grew up with in North Dakota, a small church, we didn't hear much preaching, she said, except for what you did, on these kinds of issues. And so when I got ready to go to college, I went to Harding. And she said, I can still remember, and this would have been in the 1980s that she was there, I can remember people talking in the dorm and laughing, ridiculing the Antis. And she said, I didn't know what that was. And then she said, I started to study, and I wrote to some preachers and so forth, and I found out I'm an Anti. And a lot of people have had that kind of experience. But she said, even in the 1980s, there was still this kind of prejudice against what was called Antiism. Well, here's the question, it seems to me. What kind of church did Christ die for? Did Jesus die, going back to that last part, are we supposed to be with a spiritual emphasis that tries to convert people and save their souls, or have the Lord save their souls? Or did Jesus die for daycare centers, job placement bureaus, adult education courses, medical and dental clinics, English as second language classes? That's what goes on in a lot of the institutional churches. Now, let me be clear. All of those are wonderful works. There ought to be daycare centers. People need job placement bureaus. It's good to have adult education classes so people can go out and make more money. If somebody comes and they don't know English, they need to learn English as their second language. It's good to have medical and dental clinics. The question is that the work of the church? Or is that the work of state government or the work of non-governmental organizations like the Red Cross or what have you? Is that what Christ died for? And my answer is no, I can't read anything about that. Now, another interesting quotation that I came across, this is from a guy now deceased, Abe Mallerby, a well-known New Testament scholar, wrote a number of commentaries. For a long time, he was professor of New Testament interpretation at Yale, South African, converted by Eldred Eccles, or under his preaching, came to Abilene, did his bachelor's there, and then went to Harvard, got his PhD, taught for decades at Yale. And when he retired, 3 of the 6 candidates that they interviewed to replace him for the Buckingham chair were his former students and Abilene graduates, and the one who finally got the job was one of his former students from Abilene. So here's a guy who's heavyweight, his credentials are impeccable. And here's what he said when he retired in 2002, and the Christian Chronicle interviewed him. They said, what are some of your concerns for our fellowship? Here's what he said. My major concern is our cozying up to those evangelicals, conservative Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, who are still kind of Bible believers, who put a premium on feeling at the expense of reason. They're more interested in what do you feel about things than what does the Bible say or what can you show from the Bible. Evangelical priorities and language have come to suffuse, to infect, to be a large part of much of the preaching in our fellowship. And he said that, combined with a style of preaching which is common in all churches these days, that is narratival and anecdotal. Those are fancy words for tell me a story. Make me jerk a few tears. Tell me about your mother on her deathbed. Tell me about your pet that died. Tell me about your little girl. Tell me something. Rather than expository. Rather than taking the Bible and opening it up to a text and saying, here is what the Word of God says. A lot of preaching has gone to the emotional, the tear-jerking, the anecdotal, the tell me a story, rather than open up the Bible and tell me what the Bible says. And he said that results in sermons that are as theologically thin gruel as many of the so-called praise songs we sing. Man, I wish I had said that. I have become known in some quarters as the guy who came up with the 7-Eleven songs. You heard this? 7 words, sing them 11 times. Praise songs. Well, I wish I had said that, but that was not, I didn't invent it. I borrowed it from somebody else, but I have used it a lot. And he says, it seems that the goal of many services is to achieve an emotional response without imparting biblical knowledge. We don't really care what the Bible says. We just want to get an emotional response to somebody. If we can get people in the aisle that are emotional, and if we can get them waving their hands or whatever, almost like a semi-Pentecostal service, that's what we're doing. Well, beyond the debates, what's happened since then? Some of you may be aware of the Arlington meeting in 1968, which brought brethren together to discuss in a closed session, so there's no audience to play to, what is the work of the church? What's the difference in an individual work and a congregational work? What kind of fellowship can we have with each other? Different questions like that. What institutions, if any, should the church support? And this occurred when my last year at Florida College. I remember Melvin Curry and Clinton Hamilton and others who went and spoke at this meeting, coming back and in classes they would talk a little bit about it. When I got married the next spring and moved to Marion, one of the first things that I did that Cecil Willis gave me as a task was to proofread the galleys for the Arlington meeting book. And it's still available. If you don't have it, you want a kind of a definitive study of these kinds of issues, that's the thing to have. In 1988, I was asked to organize a similar meeting in Nashville that we just ingeniously called the Nashville meeting, that brought hundreds. We opened it up this time. This wasn't a closed thing with just the speakers there, but we covered a lot of the same topics, and we had literally hundreds of people who came. We met, instead of meeting in a church building, I put it in a hotel, the Doubletree Hotel in downtown Nashville. And as you can tell, we not only filled a huge ballroom, we had to put chairs out in the hallway so that people could have a place to sit for 3 days. We had brothers who came and spoke. The way we organized it was I picked 2 guys, one on each side of the issue, a different perspective of the issue, and they spoke for 30 minutes on an assigned topic, either fellowship or the work of the church. I spoke on the history. That's how this thing got started, actually. And then the other person spoke, and then 2 other brothers gave a response to that. That took the first hour of each session. Then they sat around or stood at the podium and asked each other questions and talked, and for the most part it was pretty brotherly. And then the third hour we took questions from the audience. So everybody on the panel would be answering questions. There was a moderator that would take the questions. For the most part, everybody, we didn't act like a pack of hyenas, as often happens, but I didn't want it to be in a church building where everybody comes and one side sits on this side and the other side sits on that side, and they listen to speeches and then they go home and nobody changes their mind. I wanted people to be able to sit in the coffee shop afterwards, or say, come up to the room and let's sit and talk about this. Some of that happened, not nearly enough. So when some of them who didn't like what happened on the other side said, can we have another meeting? I organized another one in Dallas in 1990. When I say what happened on the other side, because there was a wide spectrum of beliefs on the institutional side of the question, all of that spread that we talked about before. I mean, we had guys who stood up on the institutional side and said things like, we did not have the Bible for 400 years after the New Testament era, so how could we unite on it? Roman Catholic position. Roman Catholic Church gave us the Bible after 400 years, so we didn't have the Bible for 400 years, so how could churches go by it? Another guy, preacher at one of the biggest churches in Dallas, which had just built a huge family life center, got up and said, well, if we want to do that, if we want to build a family life center, we don't really care whether the Bible authorizes it or not. If we think it'll help spread the gospel, if we think it'll help our members, we're going to do it, whether we can find a passage that gives us the authority to do it or not. Now, I knew that's what they were saying because I've been going to some of their meetings. I've tried to, sort of like Don Quixote tilting at windmills for years, I've tried to keep some communication open between guys on the other side so that when they got ready to meet, I was about the only Andy that they knew. But I knew what they were saying, and when they came to me and said, can we organize this meeting, I didn't know whether that was a good idea or not, because I could imagine a lot of our young guys, some of whom were in my classes at Danville, who might hear what these fellows were saying, and what if they found that persuasive? What if they went to the dark side of the force, if you will? And then I lost sleep over that a lot of nights, and then I realized that, well, if they're going to do that, then it's better for them to do it at 20 than to do it at 40, when they have some influence among churches. And but I also, I tried to be honest with them. I said, look, I know the arguments these guys make. If somebody has come up with a new biblical argument, a more persuasive argument, something that, Scripture says this, I want you to hear it. I mean, if there's biblical authority for doing this, then what do we need to do? We need to start doing it. We need not to say, well, my dad opposed this and I wouldn't want to go against what my dad did. No, if there's biblical authority for something, then we need to start doing that. And what happened was that it could not have been a better experience for a lot of younger preachers who had not grown up hearing this and kind of had this idea that, well, this was a controversy that was just a preacher fuss, and it was just a lot of preachers that squabbled and quibbled with each other and acted like a pack of hyenas, and for them to hear right from these guys' mouth, we didn't have the Bible for 400 years, and so there's no scriptural authority, or we don't care whether there's scriptural authority or not. Well, some of the guys on that team, if you will, they were just as appalled at that as I was. I mean, guys like Roy Lanier, Stafford North, individuals who are pretty conservative even yet. So they came to me, Johnny Ramsey was one of them, they said, can we do this again? And we'll do it in Dallas, and we'd just invite the conservative end of things. And so we did. And then I said, if somebody else wants to do this, have at it. I'm done. I'm not organizing anymore. If it's just me organizing it, then that's not worth much. So a few years later, Jim organized this meeting that produced this book. Interestingly, I've gotten a couple of calls and conversation just in the last few weeks. The editor of the Gospel Advocate, fairly new editor, excuse me, my allergies are driving me crazy. I apologize. They want some of us who they know to be on the other side to come to Nashville in May and sit down at the Gospel Advocate office and talk with them about, is there any way we can heal this breach? Because they're very concerned about this wide spectrum of churches that's headed out the left field door. So these are people that are much more conservative. Well, I'm going to tell them I don't know of anything that can be done other than start teaching the truth, but I'm willing to go anywhere at any time and talk to somebody who wants to sit down and talk about what does the Bible teach. I don't know what will come of that. I'm kind of like David Lipscomb, who said, this is my father-in-law's rendition of this. I've not ever been able to locate it, but as I've said before, if Lipscomb didn't say this, he should have. He said, supposedly, I asked my father-in-law where he had read this, and he couldn't remember. But the quotation I've heard him use a number of times, apostasies come and will come. When they come in the midst of an untaught, ease-loving, self-serving generation. If that doesn't describe the world that we live in, brothers and sisters, I ask you what does? And that's Lipscomb's idea about it. Well, all right, so what is the Lord's church? We talk about it being the undenomination. Some of you are as old or maybe even older than I am. You can remember the Uncola commercials, right? 7-Up had this big ad campaign back in the 60s and 70s, the Uncola. Well, we say we're the undenomination. We're not a denomination. And I think we need to ask ourselves, what is the church? What does this word church mean? And we often make the point that it comes from a compound Greek word, ekklesia, from the word kaleo, to call, and ek means out of. So the called out, we sometimes render it, but in common usage in the New Testament, it simply meant an assembly. Those who were called out of a larger body, or called together sometimes is how it's used, and the Bible uses the term in that way. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9, just to look at a couple of quick examples of that. Peter talks about here those who were called, you're a royal priesthood, chosen race, holy nation, people of God's own possession, and so forth, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. That's this word for called out, and it's used in a number of other places. Normally, it's used as assembly. It's most often translated by the word assembly, and it was used even before the Bible was written. It's a common Greek word, and people that spoke Greek know this word. If you look at Acts 19, there's some biblical examples of how the word is used in different senses. In Acts 19, Paul's in Ephesus. They get upset about the Diana of the Ephesians, their livelihood being cut off, the silversmiths, and so for several hours they meet in the amphitheater that's there. It's still there. If you visit Ephesus today, you can sit in that amphitheater. They have concerts and gatherings there. Well, if you look at 19 and verse 32, this word ekklesia is used in this sense. Some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly, the ekklesia, was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what cause they had come together. And then in verse 39, somebody with some sense stands up and says, if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in the lawful assembly, the town council, the city council, if you will. Now, what is a city council? Well, city council is people who have been called out of the general population. They've been selected or elected to sit on the city council. Not everybody can sit on the city council. You have to be called out, and they come together. They assemble as the council in order to do that. And then in verse 41, after saying this, he dismissed the assembly. So the crowd has now quieted down. You have a huge crowd of people that are what? They're assembled. Now, they earlier were a mob, everybody just shouting and hollering, and nobody knew what was going on or even why they were there. Or they could be a very quiet assembly listening to some person, one person speak. Paul regulates this kind of thing in 1 Corinthians 14. He said if you're in an assembly and you get people with spiritual gifts and one's saying this over there and one's saying that and one's saying this, what was Paul's instruction? Shut up and sit down. Yeah, let each one in turn say, and then if somebody else gets a revelation, the other person should sit down. Let all things be done decently in order. But that's done in an assembly, and that's the word for church. If you look, for instance, come over to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and there are several texts in which this is used. Paul says in 1 and verse 9, God is faithful, through whom you were called into fellowship with his Son. So the church at Corinth are those who have been called into the fellowship. Earlier, even in verse 2, he says the church of God, the ecclesia of God, which is at Corinth, those who have been sanctified by Christ Jesus, saints by calling. They have been called out of the world, called together as an assembly. And then again in verse 24, he says, to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. So as Christians, we're called out of the world, but we're also called together as an assembly. You can find other texts that use that. Now, as far as I can tell in the New Testament, this word ekklesia, when used of the church, now it was a Greek word that was used of just an assembly, a mob, a city council. But the New Testament takes that word, ekklesia, and uses it to describe the church. And as far as I can tell, it's used in two senses. It's used in what sometimes people have called the universal church. Now, if you don't like that word, and some brethren object to it when I use it, please come up with a better word that describes it. I will be all ears. But if you want a biblical description of what I'm talking about, it's found in Hebrews chapter 12. The church and the general assembly of the firstborn ones, plural, whose names are enrolled in heaven. Everybody in every age, in every nation, in every place who's ever been a Christian, whoever's name is enrolled in the Lamb's Book of Life in any century, that's the universal church. Now, the relevant question for us is, does that church ever function? And the answer is no. It can't function. Most of it's dead. I mean, everybody from all the preceding centuries, they're in the grave. They can't function. And there are generations yet unborn, if the Lord delays his coming, who will become Christians and be in that great general assembly. The only time this universal church will ever function is, as we say in the hymn, when we all get to heaven. And what a glorious assembly that will be when we're all hymning the praise of God and casting our crowns, all of the things that are described in Revelation. But this universal church never functions. It can't function. I have sometimes wistfully thought when I've been overseas or come back home that wouldn't it be cool, wouldn't it be great if we could get all of the brethren in Lithuania or Moscow or China and Beijing and Shanghai and all the Australian brethren and all the brethren in India and all the ones in the Philippines. We could have an internet Church of Christ hookup. If we get enough cameras in enough places and everybody has their own big screen, we'd have however many thousand split screens you had, and everybody could be online at the same time in all the time zones. Well, of course, you wouldn't have everybody. Somebody be sick, or somebody be late, or somebody whatever. Somebody sleeps in, and you couldn't do that. And besides that, even if you could, that's still just all the living people now. That doesn't resurrect all the dead people or forecast who the people in future generations will be. So this universal church exists in the Lamb's Book of Life. It will function one day when this world is no more, but on earth, it does not function. It cannot function. Well, so how does the church function? Well, the only other way I know that the Scripture uses this word is in terms of local congregations. Galatians 1:22, the churches of Christ which are in Judea. Or 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 1, as I gave order to the churches of Galatia, individual congregations, even so do you Corinthian brethren. And so you find this local congregation, a functioning unit of individual Christians who come together on the Lord's Day and at other times as well in order to do what? What do we mean by function? Do the work of the church. And as I have said before, trying to get this idea across, the most fundamental thing an ecclesia does is what? Yeah, it assembles, it gathers. We sometimes say, well, the work of the church is evangelism, edification, and benevolence. That's true, but we got to add to that list, the work of the church is to assemble. If you don't get up on Sunday morning and come where other Christians are, not much else is going to happen. You won't have a collection for the saints to help needy. You won't have a collection to support the preaching of the gospel. Now, you can go off and sing hymns by yourself or pray by yourself, and you should. We shouldn't limit our singing and praying to what we do in the four walls of a building on Sunday morning. We ought to do that all the time in every place whenever the notion strikes us to pray or to sing. We sure ought to study our Bibles. If all you're studying is for Bible class and you only crack the Bible 2 or 3 times a week, that's not going to work. So yes, we need to be individually done, but we need to do that together as Christians. That's what Christians do. They get up on Sunday. The Lord got up on Sunday, as someone said, we ought to do that too, and come where other Christians are in order to study His Word, to edify each other, to help each other with our weaknesses, to pool our resources, and that's what the church does as a functioning unit. In order to function, there have to be, I'm not going to have much, I'm not going to be able to unpack this. I think I'm going to quit with this idea. And then if you want me to come back, Bill, I can come back. But if I get started on this, there's a whole string of 25 slides behind this that we just don't have time for this morning. But think about, in terms of this functioning unit, any task, any work that gets done has to have at least 3 things that happen. Let's just say, if we're going to move this table down here, that looks pretty heavy. I don't think one guy can do that. So we need 4 brothers, one on each corner, to move this table. Now, in order to do it, three things have to happen. Number one, we have to agree to work together. If I say, I need three other guys up here and all of you to sit there and look at me, is that table going to move? No. We have to agree, we're going to move this. We have to agree what we're going to do. We're going to move it over there by that heating unit. If each of the four of us takes off in a different direction, where's that table going? It might budge in the direction the strongest guy moves it, but if we're not all working together, and we have to accept a common oversight. We have to say, all right, on the count of three, we're going to lift this up and move that way. 1, 2, 3, go. Otherwise, if I start picking it up and none of the rest of you are doing anything, especially with my bad back that I've had back surgery on, it's not going anywhere. And if Bill starts to lift after I quit lifting, then it's not going to go anywhere. So we have to say, all right, 1, 2, 3, go that direction. And then we have to pool our resources. We have to, all of us, pool, in this case, kinetic energy, lifting power, walking power, in order to move it in that direction. So common oversight, agreement to work together, pooling of resources, and that happens in a congregation. How do we pool our resources? Usually not kinetic energy, but what? We pool money. It's the currency of the realm. It's how things get done. It's how the light bill gets paid. Now, we could put up a wind turbine, I suppose, out here and generate our own, but it's probably a lot easier just to pay the electric company. We could perhaps, if we got the permits, drill a deep well and have our own water supply. Maybe. I don't know if that's legal here or not. But it's probably easier just to pay the municipal water company to deliver water to the building. We could sit on a dirt floor or a pine floor. We don't have to have pews, do we? How many want to sit on the floor? Anybody want to sit on the floor? I don't think so. Why not have pews and behave in a civilized way? And by all means, let's pad those pews, okay? Anybody ever sat on a hard church pew for an hour-and-a-half long sermon? Yeah, I've been there, done that. And of course, we got to have air conditioning in the summer, right? I know a preacher said, if you want to raise the contribution, back in the day when a lot of churches didn't have air conditioning back in the 50s, he said, you want to raise a church's contribution, just announce you're going to air condition the building. The contribution will go up. Gene?
But Steve, you got the kids quiet when we had to use fans.
Well, that's true. That is true.
We all had to do the fans, or
Yeah.
we had to draw on.
Yeah, that's right. And they also made a pretty good whap on the head. If, although my dad would just use his knuckle. I mean, I'd get whopped upside the head with his middle finger, which made an impression. I'd try to go sit with my grandma when that happened. But anyway, what's the thing that says, if Mom says no, ask Nana. If Nana says no, who are we kidding? Nana never says no. But you get the point of what I'm saying. You have to pool resources, which in most cases is money. You have to agree to work together. If you have a squabbling congregation that can't agree on how to organize a 2-car parade and everybody thinks the carpet ought to be this color, no, it ought to be that color, no, these are not good pews, we need to replace them, we need to change our service time to 9 instead of 10, we need to not meet on Sunday night, we need to put a steeple on the building, no, we can't do that. You ever heard churches squabble about stuff like that? All the time. I have sat in business meetings, I'm not making this up, and heard the brethren argue for 20 minutes over where to buy a box of chalk for the chalkboard, back when we had chalkboard before we went to overheads. I kid you not. So how do we have common oversight? The biblical answer is to have an eldership. So don't get me started on this. I've got a thread going on Facebook right now. I don't know anybody who thinks that more than a third of conservative churches of Christ have elders. My guess, I've held meetings in 40 states in hundreds of congregations. I could be wrong, but my guess it's more like 1 in 4 rather than 1 in 3. So my question is, why don't we have more congregations that have elders? Why do we insist on a situation where you've got one little struggling congregation of less than 50 people and no elders,